Henry Ford's Own Story by Rose Wilder Lane. Chapter 6. Back to the Farm. The letter from home must have come like a dash of cold water on Henry's enthusiastic plans. He had been thinking in the future, planning, rearranging, adjusting the years just ahead. It has always been his instinct to do just that. "You can't run anything on precedents if you want to make a success," he says today. "We should be guiding our future by the present, instead of being guided in the present by the past." Suddenly the past had come into his calculations. Henry spent a dark day or two over that letter, the universal struggle between the claims of the older generation and the desires of the younger one. There was never any real question as to the outcome. The machine idea has been the controlling factor in his life, but it has never been stronger than his human sympathies. It is in adjusting them to each other, in making human sympathies a working business policy, that he has made his real success. Of course, at that time he did not see such a possibility. It was a clear-cut struggle between two opposing forces. On one side the splendid future just ahead, on the other his father's need of him. He went home. He intended at the time to stay only until his father was well again, perhaps for a month or so, surely not longer than one summer. The plans for the watch factory were not abandoned, they were only laid aside temporarily. It would be possible to run up to Detroit for a day or two now and then and keep on working on plans for getting together the necessary capital. But no business on earth is harder to leave than the business of running a farm. When Henry reached home he found a dozen fields needing immediate action. The corn had been neglected, already weeds were springing up between the rows. In the house his father was fretting because the hired hands were not feeding the cows properly and they were giving less milk. The clover was going to seed, while the hogs looked hungrily at it through the fence because there was no one to see that their noses were ringed and the gates opened. Some of the plows and harrows had been left in the fields, where they were rusting in the summer sun and rain. There was plenty of work for Henry. At first, from day to day, then from week to week, he put off the trip to Detroit. He worked in the fields with the men, plowing, planting, harvesting, setting the pace for the others to follow, as an owner must do on a farm. He was learning, so thoroughly that he never forgot it, the art of managing men without losing the democratic feeling of being one of them. In the mornings he was up before daylight and out to the barnyard. He fed the horses, watched that the milking was thoroughly done, and gave orders for the day's work. Then the great bell clanged once, and he and all the men hurried into the house, where, sitting at one long table in the kitchen, they ate the breakfast Margaret and the hired girls brought to them, piping hot from the stove. After that they scattered, driving down the farm lanes to the fields, while the sun rose, and the meadows, sparkling with dew, scented the air with clover. The sun rose higher, pouring its heat down upon them as they worked, and a shrill, whirring noise rose from all the tiny insects in the grass, a note like the voice of the heat. Coats and vests came off and were tossed in the fence corners, sleeves were rolled up, shirts opened wide at the neck. "Whew, it's hot," said Henry, stopping to wipe the sweat from his face. "Where's the water jug? Jim, what say you run and bring it up? Let's have a drink before we go on." So they worked through the mornings, stopping gladly enough when the great bell clanged out the welcome news that Margaret and the girls had prepared the huge dinner their appetites demanded. In the afternoons Henry, on the little gray mare, rode to the far fields for a diplomatic, authoritative word with the men plowing there, or perhaps he went a little farther and bargained with the next neighbor for a likely-looking yearling heifer. Then back at night to the big farmyard, where the cows must be milked, the horses watered, fed, and everything made comfortable and safe for the night. It was a very different life from that in the machine shop, and Henry Ford thought, when he pored over his mechanic journals by the sitting-room lamp in the evenings, that he was wasting precious time. But he was learning a great many things he would find useful later. Margaret Ford was by this time a healthy, attractive young woman, with all the affairs of the household and dairy well in hand. The social affairs of the community began to center around her. In the evenings the young men of the neighborhood rode over to propose picnics and hay rides. After church on Sundays a dozen young people would come trooping out to the farm with her, and Margaret would put a white apron over her best dress and serve a big country dinner. They had a rollicking time in the grassy front yards afterwards, or out in the orchard when the plums were ripe. Late in the afternoon they separated somehow into pairs, as young people will do, and walked the 3 miles to church for the evening services. It may be imagined that the girls of the neighborhood were interested when Henry appeared in church again, now a good-looking young man of 21, back from the city. The social popularity of the Ford place must have increased considerably. On this point Ford is discreetly silent, but it does not require any great effort of fancy to see him as he must have looked then, through the eyes of the Greenfield girls, an alert, muscular fellow, with a droll humor and a whimsical smile. Moreover, the driver of the finest horses in the neighborhood, and one of the heirs to the big farm. However, he is outspoken enough about his own attitude. He did not care for girls. Like most men with a real interest, he kept for a long time the small boy opinion of them. Girls? Huh! What are they good for? He was interested in machines. He wanted to get back to Detroit, where he could take up again his plans for that mammoth watch factory. In a few weeks he had brought the farm up to its former running order, the crops were doing well, and the hired men had learned that there was a boss at the head of affairs. Henry had a little more time to spend in the shop. He found in one corner of it the absurd steam engine he had built 5 years before, and one day he started it up and ran it around the yard. It was a weird-looking affair, the high wagon wheels warped and wobbly, the hybrid engine on top sputtering and wheezing and rattling, but none the less running, in a cloud of smoke and sparks. He had a hearty laugh at it and abandoned it. His father grew better slowly, but week by week Henry was approaching the time when he could return to the work he liked. Late summer came with all the work of getting in the crops. The harvest crew arrived from the next farm, 20 men of them, and Henry was busy in the fields from morning to night. When, late in October, the last work of the summer was done and the fields lay bare and brown, waiting for the snow, Margaret Ford gave a great harvest supper, with a quilting bee in the afternoon and corn husking in the evening. All the neighbors came from miles around. The big barns were crowded with their horses, and rows of them were tied under the sheds. In the house the quilting frames were spread in the big attic, and all afternoon the women sewed and talked. In the evening the men arrived, and then the long supper table was spread with Margaret's cooking: hams, sausages, fried chickens, a whole roast pig, pans of beans and succotash, huge loaves of homemade bread, pats of butter, cheese, cakes, pies, puddings, doughnuts, pitchers of milk and cider, good things which disappeared fast enough before the plying knives and forks, in bursts of laughter, while jokes were called from end to end of the table, and young couples blushed under the chaffing of their neighbors. Clara Bryant was one of the guests. Her father was a prosperous farmer who lived 8 miles from the Ford place, and Henry had scarcely seen her that summer. That night they sat side by side, and he noticed the red in her cheeks and the way she laughed. After supper there was corn husking in the big barn, where each young man tried to find the red ears that gave him permission to kiss one of the girls, and still later they danced on the floor of the hay barn, while the fiddler called the figures of the old square dances, and the lanterns cast a flickering light on the dusty mounds of hay. The next week Henry might have returned to Detroit and to the waiting project of the watch factory, but he did not. He thought of Clara Bryant, and realized that his prejudice against girls was unreasonable. End of Chapter 6. Chapter 7. The Road to Hyman. With William Ford's complete recovery and the coming of the long, half-idle winter of the country, there was no apparent reason why Henry Ford should not return to his work in the machine shops. The plans for the watch factory, never wholly abandoned, might be carried out. But Henry stayed at home on the farm. Gradually it became apparent to the neighborhood that Ford's boy had got over his liking for city life. Farmers remarked to each other, while they sat in their granaries husking corn, that Henry had come to his senses and knew when he was well off. He'd have his share in as good a farm as any man could want some day. There was no need for him to get out and hustle in Detroit. Probably there were moments when Henry himself shared the prevailing opinion. His interest in mechanics was as great as ever. But there was Clara Bryant. He made a few trips to Detroit, with an intention which seemed to him earnest enough to revive the plans for the watch factory, but the thought of her was always tugging at his mind, urging him to come back to Greenfield. His efforts came to nothing, and he soon lost interest in them. He was in his early 20s then. His ambition had not yet centered about a definite purpose, and already it had met the worst enemy of ambition, love. It was a choice between his work and the girl. The girl won, and 10,000,000 50-cent Ford watches were lost to the world. "I've decided not to go back to Detroit," Henry announced to the family at breakfast one day. "I thought you'd come around to seeing it that way," his father said. "You can do better here in the long run than you can in the city. If you want to take care of the stock, I'll let one of the men go and pay you his wages this winter." "All right," Henry said. His work as a machinist seemed to all of them only an episode, now definitely ended. He settled into the work of the farm as though he had never left it. Rising in the cold, lamp-lit mornings while the window panes showed only a square of darkness, sparkling with frost crystals, he built up the kitchen fire for Margaret. Then, with a lantern in his hand and milk pails clanking on his arm, plowed his way through the snow to the barns. A red streak was showing in the eastern horizon. Buildings and fences, covered with snow, showed odd shapes in the gray dawn. His breath hung like smoke on the frosty air. Inside the barns the animals stirred. A horse stamped, a cow rose lumberingly. Old Rover barked when he heard Henry's hand on the door fastening. Henry hung his lantern on a nail and set to work. He pitched down hay in huge forks full of straw. He measured out rations of bran and corn and oats. He milked the cows, stopping before he carried the brimming pails to the house to pour out some of the warm, sweet-smelling milk for Rover and the cats. Back in the kitchen Margaret had set the table for breakfast. She was standing at the stove frying sausages and churning corn cakes. The other boys came tramping in from poultry yards and hog pens. They took turns at the tin wash basins set on a bench on the back porch, and then in to breakfast with hearty appetites. Afterward they husked corn in the big granaries, or shelled it, ready to take to mill. They cleaned the barn stalls, whitewashed the hen houses, sorted the apples in the cellar. In the shop Henry worked at the farm tools, sharpening the plows, refitting the harrows with teeth, oiling and cleaning the mowing machines. After supper, when he had finished the day's work, milked the cows again, filled the racks in the calves' yard with hay, spread deep beds of straw for the horses, seen that everything was snug and comfortable about the big barns, he saddled the little bay and rode 6 miles to the Bryant farm. It was a courtship which did not run any too smoothly. Henry was not the only Greenfield farmer's son who admired Clara Bryant, and she was minded to divide her favor evenly among them until some indefinite time in the future, when, as she said, she would see. Often enough Henry found another horse tied to the hitching post, and another young man inside the house making himself agreeable to Clara. Then, welcomed heartily enough by her big, jovial father, he would spend the evening talking politics with him, while Clara and his rival popped corn or roasted apples on the hearth. But Henry built that winter a light sleigh, painted red, balanced on cushiony springs, slipping over the snow on smooth steel runners. No girl in Greenfield could have resisted the offer of a ride in it. In the evenings, when the moon was full, Clara and Henry, warmly wrapped in fur robes, flashed down the snowy roads in a chime of sleigh bells. The fields sparkled white on either hand, here and there lights gleamed from farmhouses. Then the sleigh slipped into the woods, still and dark, except where the topmost branches shone silver in the moonlight, and the road stretched ahead like a path of white velvet. Their passing made no sound on the soft snow. There were skating parties, too, where Henry and Clara, mittened hand in hand, swept over the ice in long, smooth flight, their skates ringing. Or it happened that Henry stood warming his hands at the bank and watched Clara skating away with someone else, and thought bitter things. Somewhere between farm work and courtship he found time to keep up with his mechanics' trade journals, for his interest in machinery was still strong, but he planned nothing new at this time. All his constructive imagination was diverted into another channel. More than the loss of the Ford watches is chargeable to that laughing, rosy country girl who could not make up her mind to choose between her suitors. The winter passed, and Henry, torn between two interests, had accomplished little with either. Spring and the spring work came, plowing, harrowing, sowing, planting. From long before dawn until the deepening twilight hid the fields, Henry was hard at work. Until the pressure of farm work was over he could see Clara only on Sundays. Then summer arrived, with picnics and the old custom of bringing a crowd of young people out from church for Sunday dinner at the Fords. Now and then there were excursions up to Detroit for an outing on the lake. By the end of that summer it was generally accepted among the Greenfield young folks that Henry Ford was "going with" Clara Bryant. But she must still have been elusive, for another winter passed with nothing definitely decided. The third spring of Henry's stay on the farm arrived. Henry went over his bank account, a respectable sum, made up of his earnings on the farm and a few ventures in cattle buying and selling. "Well, father," he said one day, "I guess I'll be getting married." "All right," his father said. "She's a good, capable girl, I guess. I'll give you that South 40, and you can have lumber enough from the timber lot to build a house when you get ready." Apparently Henry had made up his mind to settle the matter. No doubt, behind the ardor he showed Clara, there was an unconscious feeling that he had spent enough time in courtship. He was impatient to get back to his other interests, to have again an orderly, smooth routine of life, with margins of time for machinery. In April he and Clara went up to Detroit and were married. A couple of weeks later they returned to Greenfield, Clara with plans for the new house on the South 40 already sketched in a tablet in her suitcase, Henry with a bundle of mechanics' trade journals and the responsibility of caring for a wife. "A wife helps a man more than anyone else," he says today, and adds, with his whimsical twinkle, "she criticizes him more." End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Making a Farm Efficient. The young couple went first to the Fords' place, where the big, roomy house easily spared rooms for them, and Margaret and her father gave them a hearty welcome. Clara, having brought her belongings from her old home, put on her big work apron and helped Margaret in the kitchen and dairy. Henry was out in the fields early, working hard to get the crops planted. Driving the plowshare deep into the rich, black loam, holding it steady while the furrow rolled back under his feet, he whistled to himself. He was contented. The farm work was well in hand. His 40 would bring in an ample income from the first year. In the house his rosy little wife was busy making the best butter in the whole neighborhood. He revolved in his mind vague plans for making a better plow than the one he was handling. He remembered noticing in his latest English magazine an article covering the very principle he would use. In the evening, after the last of the chores was done, he settled himself at the table in the sitting room, moved the big lamp nearer and opened the magazine. But Clara was busy correcting the plans for the new house. She must have the lamplight too. Henry moved the lamp back. "Would you have the kitchen here or here? This way I could have windows on 3 sides, but the other way I'd have a larger pantry," said Clara, stopping to chew her pencil. "Fix it exactly to suit yourself. It's your house and I'll build it just as you say," Henry replied, turning a page. "But I want your advice, and I can't see how to get this back porch in without making the bedrooms too small," Clara complained. "I want this house just so, and if I put the chimney where I want it to come in the kitchen, it will be in the wrong end of the sitting room, best I can do. Oh, let those horrid papers alone and help me out." Henry let the horrid papers alone and bent his head over the problems of porch and pantry and fireplace. When the pressure of spring work was over, he set to work a gang of men cutting down selected trees in the timber lot and hauling them down to the little sawmill which belonged to his father. There he sawed them into boards of the lengths and sizes he needed, and stocked them in neat piles to season and dry. From the shorter pieces of timber he split shakes, or homemade shingles, and stacked them, log cabin fashion. He was preparing to build his first house. It rose little by little through that summer. Henry built it himself, helped by one of the hired men. It was a good, substantial Middle Western home, 32 by 32 feet, and containing 7 rooms and a roomy attic. In the evenings, after supper, dishwashing, and the chores at the barn were finished, he and Clara strolled over in the twilight to inspect the day's progress. They climbed together over the loose boards which made temporary floors, looked at the skeleton partitions of studding, planned where the stoves should be set and what kind of paper should be chosen for the walls. Then they walked around the outside, imagined with pride how well the house would look when the siding was on and painted white, and planned where the flower beds should be in the front yard. "Let's be getting on back," said Henry. "I saw an article in that French magazine that came today about a Frenchman who invented some kind of a carriage that runs by itself without horses, sort of a steam engine to pull it." "Did you?" said Clara. "How interesting! Oh, look, the moon's coming up." They loitered back through the clover fields, sweet smelling in the dew, climbed over the stile into the apple orchard, where the leaves were silver and black in the moonlight, and so came slowly home. Margaret had cut a watermelon, cooled in a basket in the well, and all the family sat on the back porch eating it. Long after midnight, when everyone else was sound asleep, the lamp was burning in the sitting room, and Henry was reading that article about the horseless carriage. The idea fascinated him. The new house was finished late in the fall. Clara had made a trip to Detroit to purchase furniture, and all summer she had been working on patchwork quilts and crocheted tidies. When everything was ready, the sitting room bright with new carpet and shining varnished furniture, the new range installed in the kitchen, the cellar stocked with apples, vegetables, canned fruits, Henry and Clara moved into their own home. They were proud of it. "It's a fine place yet, as good as anybody could want," Henry Ford says now. "We still have it, and we like to go down there in the summers and stay a while. All the furniture is there, exactly as it was then. I wouldn't ask any better place to live." It must have been a happy time for both of them. They had a comfortable home, plenty to eat and wear. They were surrounded by friends. There was a simple neighborly spirit, a true democracy in that little country community. There were no very poor families there, no very rich ones. Every one had plenty and wanted no more. Henry's hired men ate at the table with him, slept under the same roof, called him Hen, as a matter of course, just as he called them Hi and Dave. They worked together to plant, care for, and harvest the crops. Their interests were the same, and if at the end of the year Henry had a more improved farm to show for the year's work, it was the only difference between them. He had lived no better, spent no more than the others. It was in those years that he laid the foundation for his philosophy of life. He found that the work of the farm progressed faster and produced more when everyone worked together with a good will, each doing his own share and doing it well. He found that men, like horses, did their best when they were well fed, contented, and not overworked. He saw that one unruly horse or one surly, lazy man delayed the work of the whole farm, hindered all the others. "The only plan that will work out well in the long run is a plan that is best for everyone concerned," he decided. "Hurting the other fellow is bound to hurt me sooner or later." He was a good farmer. His mechanical, orderly mind arranged the work so that it was done smoothly and on time, without overworking anyone or leaving anyone idle. His thrifty instincts saved labor and time, just as they saved the barn manure to spread on the fields, or planned for the turning in of the last crop of clover to enrich the soil. His granaries were well filled in the fall, his stock was sleek and fat, fetching top prices. Clara kept the house running smoothly, the pantry filled with good simple food, the cellar shelves stocked with preserves and jams for winter. In the evenings Henry got out his mechanics' journals and pored over them, while Clara sewed or mended. He found now and then a mention of the horseless carriage. "That looks to me like a good idea. If I was in Detroit now, where I could get a good machine shop, I believe I could do something along that line myself," he said. "Probably you could," his wife replied, rocking comfortably. "But what's the use? We've got everything here we need." "Yes, but I'd just like to try what I could do," Henry said restlessly. A few days later he inspected his farm shop and announced that he was going up to Detroit for a day to get some materials. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. The Lure of the Machine Shops. It was an unconscious subterfuge, that statement of Henry Ford's that he was going up to Detroit to get material. He knew what he wanted. Sitting by the red-covered table in his own dining and sitting room some evening after Clara had cleared away the supper dishes, he could have written out his order, article by article, exactly what he needed, and 2 days later it would have arrived by express. But Henry wanted to get back to Detroit. He was tired of the farm. Those years of quiet, comfortable country living among his green-field neighbors were almost finished. They had given him his viewpoint on human relations. They had saved his character, in the formative period, from the distorting pressure of the struggle of man against man in the city. They had been, from the standpoint of Henry Ford, the man, perhaps the most valuable years in his life. At that time he saw in them only an endless repetition of tasks which had no great appeal for him, a recurring cycle of sowing, tilling, harvesting. He thought he was accomplishing nothing. A little more money in the bank, a few more acres added to the farm, that was all, and it did not interest him. Money never did. His passion was machinery. So he gave his orders to the hired man, pocketed a list of things to buy for Clara, and caught the early train to Detroit that morning with a feeling of keen anticipation. He meant to spend one whole day in machine shops. From the station in Detroit he hurried direct to the James Flower Iron Works. The broad, busy streets, jammed with carriages and drays, the crowds of hurrying people, did not hold his attention for a moment, but when he came into the noisy, dirty turmoil of the machine shop he was in his element again. He took in a dozen details at a glance. Scarcely a change had been made since he had first seen the place years before, when he was a boy of 16 looking for a job. The old foreman was gone, and one of the men who had worked beside Henry in those days was in charge. "Well, hello there, Ford," he said heartily. "What are you doing these days? Not looking for a job, are you?" "No, I'm farming now," Ford replied. "Just thought I'd drop in and have a look around." Together they wandered over the works, and the foreman, shouting to make himself heard in the clanging, pounding uproar, pointed out here and there a new device, an improved valve, a different gearing. Ford saw it all with interest. He was wider awake, more alive, than he had been for months. When he was leaving the shop some time later, he had a sudden expansive impulse which broke through his customary reticence. "I'm thinking of building an engine myself," he said. "A little one to use on the farm. I figure I can work something out that will take the place of some of my horses." The foreman looked at Ford in amazement. It is hard to realize now how astounding such an idea must have seemed to him. Here was a man who proposed to take a locomotive into his cornfield and set it to plowing. The wild impossibility of the plan would have staggered any reasonable person. The foreman decided that this was one of Ford's quiet jokes. He laughed appreciatively. "Great idea," he applauded. "All you'll need then'll be a machine to give milk, and you'll have the farm complete. Well, come round any time. Glad to see you." Ford made the rounds of Detroit's machine shops that day, but he did not mention his idea again. It was gradually shaping itself in his mind, in part a revival of his boyish plan for that first steam engine he had built of scraps from his father's shop, in part adapted from the article he had read about the horseless carriage. He was obliged to keep enough horses to handle the work of the farm when it was heaviest. In the slack season and during the winter, the extra animals were necessarily idle, wasting food and barn space, and waste of any kind was an irritation to his methodical mind. It seemed to him that a machine could be built which would do a great part of the horses' work in the fields and cost nothing while not in use. That the undertaking was revolutionary, visionary, probably ridiculous to other people, did not deter him. He thought he could do it, and that was enough. "Precedents and prejudice are the worst things in this world," he says today. "Every generation has its own problem. It ought to find its own solutions. There is no use in our living if we can't do things better than our fathers did." That belief had been steadily growing in him while his inherited thrift and his machine ideas improved on the farming methods of Greenfield. It crystallized into a creed when his old friend laughed at his idea of replacing horses with a machine. He had visited the shops which interested him, ordered the material he wanted, and was on his way to the station to take the train home when he remembered the shopping list Mrs. Ford had given him and her repeated injunctions to attend to it the very first thing he did. With the usual exclamation of a husband saved by a sudden thought on the very brink of domestic catastrophe, Henry Ford turned and hurried back to make those purchases. Aided by a sympathetic clerk at the ribbon counter, he completed them satisfactorily and came out of the store, laden with bundles, just at the moment that Detroit's pride, a new steam-propelled fire engine, came puffing round the corner. It was going at the rate of 15 miles an hour, with impressive clatter and clang, pouring clouds of black smoke from the stack. Detroit's citizens crowded the sidewalks to view it as it went by. Henry Ford, gripping his bundles, stood on the curb and looked at it. Here was his first chance to see a steam engine built to run without a prepared roadbed and rails. It was the original of one of those pictures we sometimes see now with a smile, murmuring, "How quaint!" A huge round boiler, standing high in the back, supplied fully half its bulk. Ford made a hasty calculation of the probable weight of water it carried in proportion to its power. The result appalled him. He thoughtfully watched the engine until it was out of sight. Then he resumed his way home. On the train he sat in deep thought, now and then figuring a little on the back of an old envelope. "I couldn't get that steam engine out of my mind," he says. "What an awful waste of power. The weight of the water in that boiler bothered me for weeks." End of Chapter 9. Chapter 10. Why not use gasoline? One sympathizes with young Mrs. Ford during the weeks that followed. In 2 years of marriage she had learned to understand her husband's interests and moods fairly well. She had adjusted herself with fewer domestic discords than usual to the simple demands of his good-humored, methodical temperament. She had begun to settle into a pleasant, accustomed routine of managing her house and poultry yard, preparing the meals, washing the dishes, spending the evenings sewing, while Henry read his mechanics' journals on the other side of the lamp. Now everything changed. Henry had returned from that trip to Detroit with something on his mind. In reply to her anxious inquiries he told her not to bother. He was all right, a statement that had the usual effect of confirming her fears. She was sure something terrible had occurred, some overwhelming business catastrophe, and Henry was keeping it from her. From the kitchen window she saw him sitting idly on the horse block in the middle of the forenoon, twisting a straw in his fingers and frowning intently at the side of the barn. Sometimes after supper, instead of settling quietly down with his papers, he walked up and down, the sitting room, with his hands behind his back and that same frown on his forehead. At last she could endure it no longer. She begged him to tell her the worst. He replied, surprised, that it was a steam engine. He couldn't figure out the ratio of power to weight satisfactorily. The blamed thing bothered him. "Oh, is that all?" Mrs. Ford said indignantly. "Well, I wouldn't bother about it if I were you. What does an old steam engine matter anyhow? Come and sit down and forget about it." It was the one thing Ford could not do. His mind, once started on the project of building an engine to use on the farm, remained obstinately at work on the details. He spent weeks considering them one by one, thinking out adaptations, new devices, in an effort to overcome the difficulty. Still he could not see how to construct a cheap engine which would pull across his soft fields, carry the necessary weight of water, and still develop enough free power to be useful. He was still struggling with the problem 3 months after his trip to Detroit. "I declare to goodness, I don't know what's got into you, Henry. You act like a man in a dream half the time," the wife said, worried. "You aren't coming down with a fever, are you?" "I should say not," Henry replied hastily, with visions of brewed snakeroot and wormwood. "I feel fine. Where's the milk pail?" He took it and his lantern and hurried out to the barn, but even while he sat on the three-legged stool, his practiced hands sending streams of warm milk foaming into the pail, his mind returned to that problem of the steam engine. He was sure a machine could be made to do the work of horses. He was confident that he could make it if he persisted long enough. The trouble was the weight of the water. He must have it to make steam. He must have steam to develop power, and the whole power was required to haul the water. It looked like an inexorable circle. He went over it again, looking for the weak spot in the reasoning, and suddenly he saw it. Steam was not necessary. Why not use gasoline? The thought opened a door into unknown possibilities. Up to that time, as far as he knew, no one had ever dreamed of a self-propelling gasoline engine. 1,000 obstacles rose immediately before his mind: the gearing, the drive, the construction of the engine itself, a dazzling array of problems to be faced and solved. Difficulties innumerable stood in the way of his carrying out the idea. Difficulties apparently so insurmountable that 99 men in 100 would have abandoned the idea as impossible after one glance at them. Henry Ford was the 100th man. They were mechanical difficulties, and he loved mechanics. He was eager for the struggle with them. "It seemed to take me a year to finish the chores so I could sit down someplace and figure it out," he says. He finished the milking, fed the waiting circle of gleaming-eyed cats, flashed his lantern down the rows of stalls to be sure the horses were well fed and comfortable, fastened the barn doors, and hastened into the house with the milk. Every moment seemed wasted until he could reach the quiet sitting room, spread paper and pencils in the lamplight, and begin to work out some of those problems. He had never disliked the chores so much. From that time his distaste for farm work grew. Nature would not delay her orderly cycle because Henry Ford wanted to spend his days in the little farm shop. Weeds sprang up and must be cut, crops ripened and must be harvested. Morning came with 100 imperative demands on his time and strength, and night brought the chores. All the farm tasks were to Ford only vexing obstacles in his way to his real work, and they kept him from it till late at night. Then, when all Greenfield was asleep, and Mrs. Ford, after a long struggle to keep awake, had gone yawning to bed, he sat alone and worked over the problems of his gasoline engine. He ransacked the piles of mechanics' journals for suggestions. Where they failed him, he tried to think his way ahead without help. While he worked through the night, in a stillness broken only by the crowing of a rooster in some distant farmyard and the sputtering of the lamp, the possibilities of his idea gradually grew in his mind. He was not an imaginative man. The details of the engine absorbed most of his attention. But now and then, as the night wore on toward morning, he had a dim understanding of the possibilities of horseless transportation. He thought what it might mean to the world if every man had a machine to carry him and his goods over the country at a speed of 20 or even 25 miles an hour. It was a fantastic vision, he admitted, but he set his teeth and declared that it was not an impossible one. Sometimes he worked all night. Usually weariness overcame him in the small hours, and he was forced to stop and go through another day's work on the farm before he could get back to his real interests again. If the farm was to prosper, he must give it his attention every day. The margin of time it allowed for his work on the gasoline engine plans was far too little. By the end of that summer he had made up his mind that he could not spare his time for the farm. He told his wife that he had decided to lease it to his brother and move to Detroit. "My goodness, Henry, what for? We're doing well here. I'm sure you're going ahead faster than anyone in the neighborhood," she said in astonishment. "I want to get back to work in the machine shops. I can't do any work on my gasoline engine here. Even if I had the time, I haven't the equipment," he explained. "Well, I must say, here we've worked hard and got a comfortable home and a fine farm that pays more every year and 16 head of good stock, and you're going to leave it all for a gasoline engine that isn't even built. I don't see what you're thinking of," said poor Mrs. Ford, confronted thus suddenly with the prospect of giving up all her accustomed ways, her old friends, her big house with its stock of linens and its cellar filled with good things. "You can't begin to make as much in the city as you do here," she argued reasonably. "And suppose the engine doesn't work after all?" "It'll work all right. I'm going to keep at it till it does," Ford said. End of chapter 10.